So okay, let's talk about blood, and I will try my best to fill this entire board with blood composition. So blood consists of two main components, which is formed elements and plasma. Now let's start with plasma. So what are the components of plasma? Inside the plasma, you're going to find, obviously, water. It's the main component, okay? And you're going to find several plasma proteins. Within proteins, the most abundant protein in plasma is albumin, which role is to generate the proper osmotic pressure. Okay, you with me so far? Following me? Then you have beta globulins. So albumin, osmotic pressure. So that capillary osmotic pressure is due to the albumin. Beta globulins or beta globins, interchangeable. Transport proteins. Gamma globulins or gamma globins. These are antibodies essentially. Coagulation factors. Now, coagulation factors, I want you to appreciate this. Listen. So most of them are proteins. Some of them are not. I kind of put them under the same umbrella, okay? Coagulation factors, and I'm going to put fibrin, well, strictly speaking, fibrinogen. Under kind of the same umbrella. So both coagulation factors and fibrinogen are important for clotting. Does that make sense? In addition to this, plasma also contains nutrients and wastes. Respiratory gases and hormones. So we've got it broken down, pretty nicely. Now, it seems a little bit messy, but if you think about it, just from day-to-day experience, you can think, what is the role of blood, among others? Move nutrients and wastes, right? Deliver hormones, deliver oxygen and CO2, move oxygen and CO2, and of course it contains a whole bunch of proteins. So far, does that make sense? Now, formed elements are cells. So there are three main types of the blood cells. First type is red blood cells. In the future, we're going to call them RBCs. They are also called erythrocytes, and they transport oxygen. Okay. At this point, I would say this is the only thing that I want you to know about red blood cells. Okay. I mean, we're going to talk about this whole process of transport. Maybe later in the respiratory system, I decided to talk about RBCs and hemoglobin and how it works. Basically, what I want you to understand, so they are sized to feed in the capillaries. They are shaped as a concave cells, so they're shaped like this. If you look from the side, this is the shape of an erythrocyte. Does that make sense? So they're circular. Okay, they look like a bit of a donut, but imagine that instead of a donut hole, you have a membrane there. Does that make sense? So that increases the surface area and allows makes the oxygen exchange more efficient. Is that, so far, you following me here? Good? Okay, and they are the most numerous cells in the blood. Okay? Then you've got platelets. Platelets are the smallest red blood cells, and they're responsible for the formation of platelet plug during coagulation. They're responsible for hemostasis. Now, something that I want you to know, platelets, we're going to talk a little bit about how how cells of the blood are derived. Okay, it all goes from the bone marrow, right? And platelets are not even like a cell in the common sense. Those are fragments of a cell called megakaryocyte. Platelets and red blood cells, both, they do not have nucleus. Okay, no ribosomes. Basically, those are pouches, the membrane pouches with cytoplasm. And finally, the biggest, in terms of variety, the largest category of formed elements are white blood cells. Broadly speaking, white blood cells are responsible for the immune responses, and I'm going to go over different types of white blood cells with you. And two categories of white blood cells here are going to be, first big category will be granulocytes. So granulocytes have the name granulocyte because they have cytoplasmic granules which contain various chemicals. Three types of granulocytes in circulation are, first, neutrophils. Okay, neutrophils can be stained by both acidic and basic dyes, and they protect against bacteria. I also want you to know kind of a general idea how they do it, and they can do it by phagocytosis, increased inflammation, cytotoxicity, so-called chemicals of respiratory burst, and also a pretty fancy mechanism called neutrophil extracellular traps. So give me a minute of your undivided attention so I can tell you. So these mechanisms, phagocytosis, eating other cells, does that make sense? Increased inflammation, they release inflammatory cytokines to attract other cells. Respiratory burst, these cells release chemicals such as hydrogen peroxide, which oxidize the surroundings, oxidize bacteria, kill them by oxidation. Does that make sense? Finally, neutrophil extracellular traps is a pretty cool mechanism. When neutrophils die, they release their DNA, which wraps around bacteria and blocks them and doesn't let them go anywhere. Does that make sense, this part? We clear? Okay. Next type here is eosinophils. Eosinophils got their name because they can be stained with acidic dyes. Azimuthals protect against mostly eukaryotes, helminths, protozoa, to some extent fungi. They aren't particularly so we're not gonna count them as cells that are capable of phagocytosis. Okay, and the main mechanisms are cytotoxicity and respiratory burst. And then you've got a third type, basophils. So basophils mediate inflammation and this is basically the role in the mechanism. Okay? Does that make sense? Are we clear? Now, first thing that I want to highlight here, look, all these three types of cells are found in the blood. They circulate in the blood. Are you with me? When basophils migrate into tissue, some of them do, they basically turn into mast cells. I'm going to house them under the basophils. Basophils, mast cells, and even eosinophils can also mediate allergic responses. So if you have an allergy, you know who's to blame. Mostly mast cells, but to some extent basophils and eosinophils. Does that make sense? We good? Now, aside from granulocytes, another type of cells here will be not particularly surprising, agranulocytes. So among agranulocytes, you can identify two main cellular subtypes. One of them is monocytes. So monocytes, interestingly enough, they are found in circulation, and upon the exposure to various inflammatory mediators, upon the exposure to inflammation, monocytes differentiate into macrophages, which are found mostly in tissues, and they protect us virtually against everything via phagocytosis and increased inflammation. Now this part, does it make sense? Good? Second group here will be lymphocytes. Now, lymphocytes provide protection mostly against viruses and eukaryotic cells. And lymphocytes can be further divided into, okay, a little disclaimer. There's a whole bunch of small categories of lymphocytes, and we're not going to go into those woods, okay? So, three categories that I want you to know are natural killer or NK cells, T cells, and B cells. Okay? Now, natural killer cells, hear me out, they don't have particular specificity, So you don't like produce natural killer cells that are highly specific against, I don't know, influenza. They work via apoptosis. T cells represent a whole variety of different mediators of adaptive cellular response. While B cells play a critical role in adaptive humoral response. Also known as antibodies. Does that make sense? Are we clear about this part? You cool? Okay, so what you should be able to tell me if I ask you, which of the following granulocytes plays a key role in protecting us against bacteria, tell me those are neutrophils. Or which of the following cells is a granulocyte and found in circulation? Look at this. A granulocyte and found in circulation, I tell you, eosinophil, basophil, mast cell, monocyte. You look at this and say, okay, monocytes are a granulocyte found in circulation. Does that make sense? So it's basically like if you can produce back this scheme, that would be great. Okay, we're good so far? Okay. Now, last thing that I want to add to this little video is the general idea how blood cells are generated. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of plasma. So it all starts with the bone marrow stem cells. Okay. Bone marrow stem cells in the bone marrow. And under the stimulus, they eventually can be derived into actually two precursors. Okay, so we've got two lineages. You've got lymphoid lineage and myeloid lineage. So cells of the lymphoid lineage are essentially lymphocytes. Cells of myeloid lineage, everything else. Okay, does that make sense? Got it? Now, what kind of stimulus will generate? Look at this. So broadly speaking, if you take, check this out, if you take hypoxia or anemia, basically low levels of red blood cells, it will result in the release of erythropoietin in kidneys, which results in the increased red blood cell production. Does that ring the bell, so to say? Good? So this is why some athletes used to use erythropoietin as the performance enhancement drug. And this is what happens. This is why many endurance athletes, they live and train in the mountains where oxygen concentration is lower, so they basically live in a state of hypoxia. So when they compete at like sea level, they have a natural advantage. Now, what about like granulocytes and agranulocytes? You can have an infection, okay, And that, we're going to talk about how it stimulates, but that results in the production of white blood cells. Okay, does that make sense? Of all sorts. And then platelets, well, for platelets, thrombocytopenia, so reduced amount of platelets, okay? Will increase the levels of thrombopoietin, more platelets. Okay. And what I want to highlight here, by the way, speaking of thrombopoietin, platelets are derived from, as I mentioned, megakaryocytes. So those megakaryocytes are actual cells, like nucleus, membrane-bound organelles, all of it. Does that make sense? But then platelets are pinching off megakaryocytes. Does that make sense? One important feature of platelets, which I didn't mention, I should add it here. Platelets, in addition to formation of a platelet plug and regulating coagulation, so platelet plug, coagulation, they also recently, basically starting in the late 90s, the role of platelets in inflammation has become more and more acknowledged. Does that make sense, this part? Okay. Now this is largely what I call, information that is suitable for flashcards. Okay, you just put the names of the cells, what do they belong to, like, say, basophil, granulocyte, white blood cell, mediates inflammation, and just move on. Does that make sense?